Yo, what's up guys, Alf here, and today I'm going to be doing part 1 of my Modern Horizons 3 set review for both Historic and Timeless. So, if you're not aware, Modern Horizons 3 is going to be landing on Arena on June 14th, I believe, and I'm so excited for this set. Honestly, this is the most excited I've ever been for a set on Arena. It's going to be legal on both Historic and Timeless. Obviously, there's going to be a bunch of stuff that's pre-banned in Historic, especially the free spells like Grief that I've got up here. They haven't announced what the free spells, what the pre-banned stuff in Historic is, so as I go through all these cards, if I think a card is going to be pre-banned in Historic, I'll mention it. If there are any specific applications of cards in Historic, I'll mention that as well. But if I don't specifically mention Historic and I think a card is going to be good in Timeless, obviously I think it's going to be good in Historic as well. So Modern Horizons 3 is obviously a huge set, and there's going to be a ton of playable cards here as well. So I was originally going to wait until the full set was spoiled and then cover it all, but there's just way too many cards to cover compared to a regular set. So I'm going to have to split this up into multiple parts. Going to do part 1 now, and then once the full set's spoiled, I'm going to do a part 2, or if there's a ton of extra cards, I might even have to split it into 3 parts. I'm also going to be doing an article on the MTG Zone site that will have a ton more detail on all these cards. It's going to be like a written up set review with some sample deck lists as well. So definitely keep your eye open for just the free MTG Zone site. That'll be going up in the next few days as well. I also just want to quickly say sorry for the lack of videos over the past couple of weeks. I have been focusing on getting the tier list updated for Historic and Timeless. I've recently got those updated with a meta report if you want to check them out. But in terms of working on other decks, I felt like it was kind of pointless working on Historic and Timeless decks with Modern Horizons 3 coming out so soon. It's going to completely change both of those formats. Alchemy, the heist deck, is everywhere right now, and I didn't really feel like trying to figure out the heist mirror, and I think the best deck to beat the heist decks is the Naya Legends list, which I've already done a video on. And then Explorer is the format for the next qualifier, but since it's the new version of the qualifier, I want to do really well in that, so I'm going to be focusing and keeping the decks that I'm working on under wraps for that until after the qualifier. So my main focus right now is just focusing on Modern Horizons 3 stuff, right? I'm going to be focusing on Theorycraft lists that I'm going to be posting on the site, and just set review stuff as well. And then once the set comes out, I'm going to be doing a ton of testing, working on a bunch of different ideas, and then once the set's out, I'm going to be putting out a ton of different videos, so I'm so excited for it. But anyway, let's just get straight into it. So starting off here with the bonus sheets from Modern Horizons 3, and we're getting the Pitch Elementals, which is such a monumental addition to Timeless. I would be absolutely shocked if these aren't pre-banned in Historic, so I'm only really going to be talking about the Timeless applications here. So starting off with Grief, I think this is definitely going to be the biggest impact one, and we've obviously seen what this card can do in Modern, right? Using this with the scam cards like Not Dead After All or Ephemerate leads to some insane starts where you can pitch this on turn 1, bounce it with a Not Dead After All or Ephemerate, get a second activation off it, and then have a 3-2 Menace on turn 1, which is insane. But also in Timeless, this works very well with Reanimate as well, right? We've obviously seen a number of decks use the Troll of Khazad-dûm with Reanimate package. This is kind of the missing piece to just add extra redundancy, where you can go Grief on turn 1, or you evoke Grief, reanimate it, get the second thing. So it basically just acts as another way to scam Grief on turn 1 that also enables you to reanimate stuff like Troll of Khazad-dûm as well. So absolutely going to be a slam dunk in those sorts of decks. I could also see this working very well again alongside Necropotence or something like that, where you run Ritual and Grief and Necropotence, and you can scam Grief on turn 1, then cast Necropotence and just refuel your hand to offset the cards you lost. So this is going to be such a big addition to the format. In terms of the impact it's going to have in general, I think this is a really big hit against very high synergy decks, especially combo decks. I think Show and Tell and stuff like that is really going to get hurt by this. Decks that don't care as much about Grief are typically low synergy mid-range decks, so, the Rakdos scam mirror matches, for example, and also just decks that can top deck well. So if you run a bunch of cards that are very high impact cards to draw off the top, those are the sorts of decks that don't really care about Grief. But in general, I do think this is going to make it more difficult to play very high synergy or combo based decks, which I don't think is a necessarily bad thing, but I expect to see this card a bunch. Rakdos Scam was obviously one of the best decks in Modern before Fury got banned, and basically all of the cards are available in Timeless, plus Reanimate and Troll of Khazad-dûm. So if you want a very effective deck to play on day 1 of Modern Horizons 3, I would very much just look at porting over the modern version of Rakdos Scam, adding in the Troll Reanimator package, and you've already got a really sick deck straight away there. So I expect this card to see a ton of play. The next up, speaking of which, we've got Fury, another part of the Rakdos Scam deck. Obviously recently got banned in Modern, and this is another card that I think, like Orcish Bowmasters, is really going to determine what creatures are playable. You know, obviously X1s have been very risky to run because of Bowmasters, and I think you do need to bear in mind, you know, obviously you can run X2s with Fury around, but I think decks that rely on having a density of smaller creatures are really going to struggle with the addition of Fury to the format. And like I said, I do expect Rakdos Scam to be one of the most popular decks initially, because the deck is basically already built and was, you know, previously the best deck in Modern before Fury ended up getting banned. So I expect this to be a huge addition there, and obviously any other red deck can run this as well, especially if you just want to be killing smaller creatures, but Rakdos Scam, this is going to be a huge part of that deck. Then Solitude, again, another really, really powerful card. You know, this is another card that you could run in Orzhov Scam, potentially, with, you know, Grief and Ephemerate, but this is also just really nice in Control as well, as a free removal spell that you can also just flash in, gains you life. The opponent gaining life, similar to Swords to Plowshares, is also a really big deal against Death Shadow. Death Shadow has been very popular in Timeless recently, and using this to exile one of the opponent's creatures, then gain them life, and then Shadow dies is going to be a really big play there as well, I imagine. And I also kind of expect these kind of 4-color value decks that we haven't really seen too much of in Timeless recently to get quite popular, because I think if Rakdos Scam initially is a very popular deck, which I do kind of see happening, I do think the 4-color or just the general kind of mid-range soup value decks to be very good against the Grief decks, because they have Omnath and the One Ring and stuff like that as a way to, you know, top deck out the situation. Obviously Up the Beanstalk is going to be a very, very powerful card alongside these pitch elementals as well, so I could definitely see those bigger value decks being very good, and Solitude seems like it fits very well in those sorts of decks as well. Obviously the Rakdos deck does have Blood Moon to punish the 4-color decks, but you don't even necessarily need to run that many colors, and you can obviously fetch basics as well. So Solitude going to be fitting in Control, Orzhov Scam, just any white deck really, honestly, and then also the kind of the 4-color or just the general value mid-range decks as well. And then Subtlety is also another really nice addition. Seen this in a number of decks in Modern, you know, whether that's just general blue control decks, or I think Merfolk is going to be a very good deck, and this seems like a really nice addition to that sort of deck as well. With the new Flare, I'm not sure which one you would play or whether you would play both, but either way, you know, if you've played Modern, you know how good this card is in a number of blue decks. And then Endurance is the only one of the bunch that I don't think is really main deckable, unless the format is very graveyard-centric, but this is a really nice sideboard card that basically any green deck can run as just a very easy way to get graveyard hate, which seems really nice as well. So these cards are going to be absolutely huge. We're going to be seeing an absolute ton of them in Timeless. And in terms of cards that become a lot better with the addition of these, obviously, as I mentioned, Up the Beanstalk is still legal in Timeless. I think that card is going to be very big. Obviously, Bowmasters punishes it, but you have both Fury and Solitude as a way to just kill the Bowmasters straight away, which is really big. So I expect Up the Beanstalk to be good. The new Satoru is another card that I've been very excited about, and I think pitch elementals alongside Ephemerate, particularly if you run like Esper with Grief and Solitude, seems really nice with that as well. And then Yorion is another one, especially in, you know, Solitude kind of value decks, that is a really nice addition to these sorts of decks, because, you know, if you are scamming these elementals, having Yorion in your companion zone, it just gives you another really nice ETB to blink with Yorion if you are running these bigger value style decks. So these are going to have a massive impact in the format for sure. Then in terms of other cards that are in the bonus sheet, we've got Prismatic Ending, which, like I said, is going to be a really nice addition to those multicolored, you know, 4-5 color mid-range decks. You can also just run this in decks that want to be fetching multiple colours. Anyway, Domain Zoo could be interested in this. I don't know whether you'd run it in the main or side deck, but if you're running a deck with, you know, multiple colours, this is a really efficient removal spell to have access to. Then we've got Dismember for the first time, which is really nice. So this is a really big deal for just decks that don't run good removal spell colours. Like if you're running a deck that's just mono green, for example, or we're getting some colourless cards or a lot of colourless cards in this set. So if you're running a colour that doesn't have great removal, this is a really nice card to have access to there. The Life Loss could also be nice in Death Shadow decks, for example. So this is a really nice addition, especially if you're running, you know, mono green or something like that. And then next up we got Persist, which is a really big addition, because I do think that now full Reanimator is going to be an archetype in Timeless. I think the big issue with it when Reanimate spoiled was just that the next best Reanimator card wasn't anywhere near as good, right? Priest of Fell Rites is so easy to kill. Burial Rites is just way too expensive. Victimize is just too difficult to set up. Persist is now a really good next best option. So you run 4 Reanimate, 4 Persist, 4 Troll of Khazad Doom, 4 Grief is a really big addition to Reanimate as an archetype as well. And then We don't have Archon of Cruelty spoilt yet. There's still obviously time. It could get a reprint, in which case 4 Archon of Cruelty seems like a slam dunk in these sorts of decks. But even if we don't get that, we've still got Serra's Emissary, which seems like a pretty reasonable non-legendary creature to be reanimating in these sorts of decks. In Timeless specifically, we also have Phyrexian Scrapyard, which seems like a really big addition to Reanimator, a land that can discard your reanimation cards. Now, obviously that becomes a little bit sketchy if you're trying to run more than 2 colors, but if you're mono black, or you're black-white for Ephemerate to go with Grief, maybe you run Solitude as well, or if you're running just a second splash, you can definitely run Phyrexian Scrapyard in your sorts of decks as well. So really excited to try out Reanimator as an archetype with Persist. Now, my one concern about it is that I do think people are still going to be running Surgical Extraction, which is an absolutely back-breaking card against Reanimator, but Reanimator is probably going to be running 4 Thoughtseize for Grief, which is a good way that you can preemptively get rid of Surgical Extraction. So I'm really, really excited to try out Reanimator, and I think it's going to be a really big deck in Timeless. I'm not sure whether this is going to be legal in Historic. If it is, we've seen Reanimator in Historic already with Priest of Fell Rites and Burial Rites. I do think the issue in Historic is going to still be that Persist will be by far and away the best card, and the next best alternative isn't great. But, we've seen these Mardu mid-range Reanimator decks be viable in the past, and I don't think swapping out Atraxa for Serra's Emissary or Archon of Cruelty, if we get that, is going to be that much of a downgrade. So definitely excited to try this out in Historic as well. Then next up, we've got a new cycle of free cards called Flares, and I'm super excited about these because they're very powerful, but they don't seem as degenerate as the elementals, because you need a creature in play to be able to use them, which limits their speed and deck building restrictions as well. So starting off with Flare of Cultivation, which is basically Cultivate, but you can cast it for free if you sacrifice a non-token green creature. So again, free spells I don't think are part of the identity of Historic. So again, I would be shocked if these are legal in Historic. So only going to be talking about Timeless applications here. So for this one, the obvious natural home in Timeless is going to be the Primeval Titan deck. However, there are some deck building restrictions that you need to be able to meet for this card to be good. So first of all, you need to be running a high density of non-token green creatures. In Titan, you're already running 4 Grazer, 4 Kami, and you can have some crazy starts with this card where you go Kami on turn 1, put a Sunken Citadel into play, use Flare of Cultivation, put a Forest into play and get another land into your hand. Then on turn 2, you untap with 3 lands. If you have a Castle Garenbrig, you can play the Garenbrig and then just cast Primeval Titan on turn 2, which is so powerful. Like I said with the deck building restrictions though, you do need to have a high density of green creatures. Obviously you got 4 Grazer, 4 Kami, 4 Once Upon a Time that can find those, but I don't think that's enough. So I think the one big change in terms of deck building I'd probably cut the Sylvan Scryings to make room for this. And then I think I also want to be replacing Archdruid's Charm and going back to Fierce Empath as just another creature that you want to be running in the deck anyway, and is also just another good fodder for Flare of Cultivation, right? Because you can go Elvish Rejuvenation on turn 2 or 3, find your Primeval Titan, cast this, ramp even further, because the issue with this card is that it is extra ramp. You need to have more ways to get your payoffs, or you're just going to have hands with a bunch of ramp and nothing to spend it on. And Fierce Empath, both finding your top end and being a good fodder for Flare of Cultivation, seems really nice as well. And it also works well with the curve, right? You're pretty happy to wait until turn 2 or 3 to use your Flare of Cultivation with the Rejuvenator. Now, when I was theory crafting Titan, I was a little bit concerned that that wouldn't be enough, right? You do have 16 ways, 4 Grazer, 4 Kami, 4 Once Upon a Time, 4 Fierce Empath, but my concern was that all of those creatures have ETBs, and I think once people get accustomed to playing against Flare of Cultivation, people are going to be killing your green creatures in response to the ETB, not only to deny Flare of Cultivation, but also to deny Natural Order as well. However, so I was thinking about what's the next best option. Ideally, you want 1-drops because getting this down early is really impactful. But the next best option I could really think of was C-Note Scout, which isn't really a card that I think Titan wants to be running. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I don't think it's that much of a big issue, because just hard casting this isn't the worst thing in the world, right? If the opponent does Fatal Push or bolt your Arboreal Grazer on turn 1, you can just hard cast this on turn 2, which obviously isn't great to be hard casting Cultivate and Timeless, but as just the floor of the card in case the opponent does kill your green creatures, I think it's completely fine. So I'm really, really excited to play this in Titan. In terms of cutting Archdruid's Charm, I think the other deck building restriction you need to think of with Flare of Cultivation is you do need to be running a decent number of basic lands for the second or third copy of this to be live. I think the bare minimum of basics I would want to be running is 4, but I could see upwards of, 6 or 7 in Titan. And the big issue with that, with Archdruid's Charm, is if you wanted to run Archdruid's Charm, all of those basics would probably need to be, forests, because otherwise you don't have room in the mana base for non-green utility lands like Bojuka Bog and Westvale Abbey and stuff like that. And if you run, 2 snow-covered basics, 2 regular basic forests, that delays Field of the Dead coming online if you draw it in multiples. So I think what you want to be doing with this is probably cutting Archdruid's Charm for Fierce Empath, and then not needing triple green means that you can run basic forest, snow-covered forest, and then a basic and a snow-covered of whatever off-color you're splashing for sideboard cards like White Forget Lost, for example. So I do think this is going to change how Titan is built slightly, but I think this is going to be such a big addition for the speed of the deck, which is a really big deal. Outside of Titan, this is just a good card in terms of ramp in general, and I've been theory crafting other cards that work very well with this if you're not worried about enabling Field of the Dead, and one of those is Forceful Cultivator, because in this set, we're getting a bunch of new MDFCs, including a green one. So we're getting another MDFC that can be played untapped if you pay 3 life. And if you are just running a generic ramp deck, whether that's mono green or splashing another color, you can run 4 Kami, 4 Grazer, 4 Forceful Cultivator, and then run a bunch of MDFCs to consistently be able to cast this on turn 2. And going Forceful Cultivator on turn 2, ramp a land into play, then cast the Flare, sacking the Cultivator to get another land into play. That seems incredibly powerful. So if you're not interested in casting Primeval Titan and you're ramping into something else, which we are getting a number of payoffs in this set, this seems like a really interesting addition to consider there as well, because of the new MDFCs that we're getting. Then next up, we got Flare of Denial, and this is probably the most powerful of the cycle. I think Flare of Cultivation is probably up there as well, but Flare of Denial, another free count, well, the first free count spell that we're getting in Timeless outside of Pact of Negation, and this is a really interesting one. So 3 mana can't basically cancel, but you can play it for free if you sacrifice a non-token blue creature. So this is obviously insanely powerful, but you need to be running blue creatures that you're fine sacrificing. So the first deck that comes to mind with this is Merfolk. Merfolk as a tribe already runs a bunch of Merfolk, cheap blue Merfolk that they're happy to sacrifice, whether that's Shoreline Scout, Silvergill Adepts, or Merfolk Trickster, for example. So this seems incredible in Merfolk, just there because that's kind of plays the tempo role pretty well. So you can cast your early creatures, tap out, and still have Flare of Denial up to be able to counter whatever the opponent plays, as well as having the Lord that enables you to sacrifice your other Merfolk to counter non-creature spells. So Merfolk seems like a really big addition. We're also getting another nice addition later in the set that I'm going to talk about as well. In terms of other homes for this, I think Dredge is worth considering for this, because that's a deck that gets back Narcomoebas and Prized Amalgams for free that you're happy to sacrifice, as well as stuff like Merfolk Secret Keeper as an enabler. So this could be an interesting card in Dredge. Now, Dredge is an interesting deck because if you cut enablers for this, then your opening hand is a little bit worse. And if you cut payoffs for milling for this, then milling yourself you're going to have a lower hit rate on your mills as well. But this seems so powerful, and Dredge not having good interaction is a big deal for the deck as well. So I'm definitely interested in trying this out in Dredge as well. And then the other home I'm excited to try this out in is kind of a controlling Wizard shell. So I think Flame of Anora is a card that hasn't really had a chance to shine in Timeless yet, just because there aren't, obviously, we don't get the buffed Symmetry Sage, so the more aggressive Wizards build isn't that viable. But we do still have Snapcaster Mage, which is really good to sacrifice to this, right? You Snapcaster, flashback something like a Lightning Bolt or a Brainstorm, and then you just got it on the battlefield to sacrifice to Flame of Anora, to Flare of Denial. You've obviously got Tishana's Tidebinder as well, which you can use to, counter a triggered ability, and then you can sacrifice it to the Flare of Denial as well. And we are getting some other Wizards in this set as well that could be worth considering as well. So that's potentially another home where you could just run this as a cancel that you can sometimes cast for free off Snapcaster Mage and Tidebinder. Not 100% sure on that one, but I'm definitely still excited to try it out. Then next up, we've got the Black Flare, which is a really interesting card as well. So this is basically a decent removal spell that you can cast for free by sacrificing black creatures. Now, obviously, deck building restriction is fairly high on this. You do need to be running a deck that is running cheap black creatures that you're happy to sacrifice. So obviously, Bloodghast is the main one that comes to mind, and I think, the deck that this will slot into most naturally is Sacrifice. Now, Sacrifice in Timeless isn't a deck that's seen much play at all. I've been excited to try Sacrifice in Timeless with Goblin Bombardment for a while. The main thing that really held it back for me was Show and Tell being everywhere, but now with that deck, kind of falling off a little bit, and especially with Grief coming out, I think those sorts of decks are going to be less prevalent. So Sacrifice with Goblin Bombardment, and especially Grief and potentially Fury in those sorts of decks as well, seems like it could definitely be a viable strategy. So I'm really excited to try out Flare of Malice in those sorts of decks where you're running Bloodghast. You could be running stuff like Shambling Ghast or just, Force Forsaken Miner to go alongside the Goblin Bombardment, which are all decent creatures to sacrifice to this. And then past that, there aren't really too many other decks that run a lot of black creatures. But again, another deck that comes to mind here is Dredge, because obviously that's a deck that runs Stitches Supplier, Bloodghast, Prized Amalgam, sometimes Silver Smoke Ghoul as well, which are all creatures that you're happy to sacrifice to the Flare. Now, I don't think you can run both Flare of Denial and Flare of Malice because, like I said, if you cut Enablers, that makes your opening hands less consistent. If you cut Payoffs, it makes your mills less consistent. So I think if I was running Dredge, I would probably main deck Flare of Denial, sideboard Flare of Malice, but this seems like a really interesting addition to there as well. But either way, these are huge cards that are going to be very impactful straight away, and I imagine as more cards get added to the format, they're going to get even better. The next up, we got Flare of Duplication, which is a really interesting card. Again, I feel like this is kind of another sleeper card because I was thinking about proactive ways to use this and nothing was really coming to mind because you would need to be running a deck that has a lot of non-token red creatures to be able to sacrifice to this, and then a payoff, right? Or to be honest, multiple payoffs, because the risk with running a card like this, if you want to use it proactively, is that you're going to draw this without your big instant or sorcery that you want to copy with it. So I couldn't really think of a good use for this in Timeless. This is definitely one where I'd love to hear your input. If you've got a good suggestion or a good archetype or deck that could utilize this, definitely let me know in the comments. But the one thing I do think this will be used for is in the sideboard of red creature decks against counter spells, because if you sideboard this in against a control deck, say you cast, an early 1-drop, an early red 1-drop, for example, and then you cast something and the opponent tries to use Mana Drain or a counter spell on it, you can use Flare of Duplication, sacrifice your red creature, copy the opponent's counter spell, and then counter the counter spell, which is even more punishing if you Mana Drain their Mana Drain, right? So I definitely expect this to be a really interesting addition to red sideboards, because the only effect similar to this that the red has had access to is Tybalt's Trickery, which is significantly worse if you're using it fairly, and it's also restricted in Timeless as well. So Flare of Duplication, really interesting sideboard option for red decks, and then if you can figure out how to use this proactively, it seems very strong as well. And then finally, we've got Flare of Fortitude, which is the white one. I think this is probably the weakest of the bunch, mainly because of Divine Purge, right? The way I see this being used is as a way to protect your board against sweepers or, mass destruction effects. If you're playing an artifact deck or a Hammer Time deck or something like that, this seems really nice there, but it doesn't protect against Divine Purge, which is a big deal. Now, having said that, blue-white control isn't massively popular in Timeless. And the main issue I've got with this card is that I just don't think it has a good home immediately, right? You would need to be running a deck that wants to protect its permanence, but also just has an excess of white creatures. Typically a deck like Hammer isn't really good enough in Timeless anyway, but if you were running a deck like that, you would need to have a creature to equip the Hammer to, and then a spare white creature to sacrifice, which doesn't seem like it will always happen. So this is definitely a card that, again, I think is kind of a sleeper card. I'm sure there'll be decks in future that are interested in this, but if you are trying to protect your whole board, Divine Purge is definitely a concern for this card being good in that sort of slot, if that makes sense. But definitely one to bear in mind going forwards. Then next up, we got Ampted Raptor, and this card seems insane to me. This just feels kind of like a 2-mana Bloodbraid Elf. Now, obviously, the body is worse, and you don't get to hit bigger cards, and there is definitely some deck building considerations you need to make with this card, but if you build where this is going to hit consistently, this card seems absolutely insane. So first of all, I think if you're running any Lurrus deck without counter spells, this is just a slam dunk 4 of, right? It's a 2-mana 2/1, cast a Thoughtseize for free, cast a Mishra's Bauble for free, cast an Orcish Bowmasters for free. Obviously, the worst case scenario is you Amped Raptor and you hit another Amped Raptor, and then you don't get to go again because you didn't cast it from your hand. But even then, 2 mana for 2/2/1 first strikes isn't bad, and you also get 2 energy lying around, which could be relevant if you are running bigger cards. So this seems like an absolute slam dunk there straight away. But you can obviously use this if you're going a little bit bigger. So what I'm really excited to try out is potentially a 4-color mid-range deck that is running Attune with Aether and this new card, Tune the Narrative. So Attune with Aether, if you don't know, is a green 1-mana sorcery, put a land into your hand, gain 2 energy, and then Tune the Narrative, draw a card, you gain 2 energy as well. So if you run all 8 copies of these, you have a pretty decent chance of going Tune the Narrative or Attune with Aether on turn 1, into Amped Raptor on turn 2, and then you can cast stuff like Minsc and Boot or the One Ring on turn 2, in addition to Amped Raptor, which seems insane. Then you can also run Jarsil as well, or, if you run Jarsil, you can go Amped Raptor into Jarsil, cast, immediately recast the Attune with Aether or Tune the Narrative, draw a card, and then gain extra energy, so extra Amped Raptors can hit your 4-drops as well. So this card seems so strong. Like I said, if you're just running a Lurrus deck without counter spells, you don't have to do any other work for this to be good. If you do run these one drops, the ceiling of this card becomes even higher. So this card just seems absolutely insane to me. I would be shocked if this card doesn't have a really big impact. So next up we're getting Harbinger of this Seas, which is a wild addition because it's basically Magus of the Moon, but it turns all non-basics into islands instead. And I actually think this is better than Magus because turning all stuff to islands means that the opponent can't just bolt it, for example. But this is really big, especially because it's a Merfolk and a Wizard. So as I mentioned previously, Merfolk is getting a pretty big buff in this set because of the blue flare. And I think Harbinger is another big reason why I'm really excited to try out Merfolk, because this is going to be really punishing against the bigger decks like Titan, the multicolored decks in general, and also turning non-basics into islands makes your Master of the Pearl Trident particularly good, right? You know, we've seen a lot of Merfolk decks in Modern use Spreading Seas as a way to give their creatures unblockable. Harbinger of the Seas not only locks out these multicolored decks if they don't proactively fetch basics, but it also just basically gives your whole board unblockable if you have a Master of the Pearl Trident out, which is a really big deal as well. Then in addition to that, it's also a Wizard, which is very big for Flame of Anor. So again, this is another card that you could run in that sort of, you know, is it Wizard style shell with Snapcaster Mage and Tishana's Tiebinder potentially, but you could also run a Wizard's version of Merfolk, because there are a decent number of good Merfolk that also happen to be Wizards. So you could potentially run Is It Merfolk or Team of Merfolk with Flame of Anor. Obviously running 3 colors is a little bit more sketch when you're running a Blood Moon style effect like this, but that's definitely another interesting addition as well. But even outside of that, even if you're not running Flame of Anor or Merfolk, I think this is just a solid sideboard card in blue decks, right? There are a number of decks that run blue but don't run red, so getting access to a Blood Moon style effect in blue is a really big deal. So this is going to be a really big addition. Make sure you're running basics, make sure you're fetching them proactively. Then next up we got Nethergoyf, so essentially a 1-mana Tarmogoyf, but it only counts stuff in your graveyard, which is, you know, obviously a reasonably big difference, but the difference between 1 and 2 mana is absolutely huge. So this is just going to be a slam dunk in basically most mid-range decks. I think it's obviously compatible with Lurrus as well, and you do also have the escape ability. It is pretty tricky to set up, but the fact, you know, even if this didn't have the escape ability, I think it would be playable. The fact it also has this extra line to give you something, you know, to allow you to grind into the late game a little bit easier is just the cherry on top. So if you're running a mid-range deck in black, which the majority of mid-range decks are running, especially with Grief coming, and you also get Thoughtseize as well, this is going to be a slam dunk. I think this is going to be great in Scam. I think this is going to be great in Jund. I think this is just a phenomenal card. I'm really excited to play with it in mid-range. And then next up we got Eladrami Korvecdal, which does 2 really powerful things. So first of all, it's basically a future sight for creatures. We've seen kind of a similar effect with Realmwalker in the past, but this doesn't care about creature types. This can just cast creatures off the top of your library, you know, without caring about that. So first of all, I'm excited to try this out as a Chord of Calling target in Yawgmoth, because in previous builds of Yawgmoth, I have run stuff like Wickerwing Effigy and Historic, which felt really powerful, right? The deck does run stuff like Elven Chorus, which does a similar thing. So being able to get an Elven Chorus style effect that's Chord of Calling, you can tutor it off Chord of Calling, seems really big. Now, the one downside with that is that in the current builds of Yawgmoth, you're running Natural Order, so you got 4 extra whiffs in addition to Chord of Calling, plus your Crater Hoof and your Atraxa are also whiffs off the top for the most part. But the other ability also seems really nice with those cards, right? One of the big issues with running Natural Order in Yawgmoth is that if you draw your Yawgmoth or your Crater Hoof and get stuck in your hand, this card also gives you a way to cheat those creatures into play, which seems really big. Now, obviously, this card is so generically powerful that I think it's going to see play outside of Yawgmoth, but I think that's just the most natural home in a pre-existing shell. Outside of that, I think Elves gets a pretty big buff that I'm going to talk about later. This seems excellent in Elves. I think Elves is obviously going to be running Chord of Calling, so you could run this as a one-off, but I could also see running multiples of this. It seems really good. Gives you a way to kind of parlay that mana advantage into card advantage, and then obviously is very nice if you want to cheat Crater Hoofs into play to just allow you to win out of nowhere, which is pretty big. You can run Fierce Empath in Elves alongside this to tutor Crater Hoof to cheat into play off this. If you're running Tyvar in Elves, which I think is a good way to build it going forwards, because we're getting Priest of Titania that I'm going to talk about a little bit later, you can then activate this at instant speed. You could also consider running Agatha's Soul Cauldron to get the ability off this as well. So a lot of different opportunities to use this card. I think if you're running a creature heavy deck, especially if you're running a Chord of Calling deck, this is definitely a card I'm interested in considering there. And then next up we got Phelia Exuberant Shepherd, which is a card I'm really excited about. I think this card's actually really powerful. So it's very reminiscent of Soul Herder, which isn't a card that's seen play in either format really, right? In Timeless it's obviously way too slow and dies to Bowmasters. Even in Historic it hasn't seen a ton of play really, just because it's kind of clunky. But this card does a very similar thing, but it's just all round much more efficient. The difference between 2 and 3 mana is absolutely huge, so that's a really big deal. And having Flash is a really big deal as well, because it means the opponent is more likely to tap out and not hold open removal, and this is very much a must-kill threat that can snowball the game very quickly. So having Flash, being able to take the opponent by surprise, forcing them to, you know, it taxes their removal, makes sorcery speed removal much less effective. Stuff like Fury is a really big one for that. So having Flash is huge, and then it can also exile your opponent's creatures instead to clear the way for you to be able to attack. So I'm really excited to try this out in kind of an Esper shell alongside Satori. You know, I think Satori and Soul Herder is something I've been experimenting with in Historic recently, and Soul Herder has just felt like the slow, weak link. Having a card that is just much more efficient seems really good. Blinking all your ETB creatures, drawing a bunch of cards off Satori seems really nice. And then also running it alongside Solitude and Grief and Ephemerate seems excellent as well, because obviously you want to be running Solitude and Grief alongside Ephemerate to be able to scam the opponent. But Ephemerate also works very well with your Blink creatures. It also draws you cards off Satori as well. So I'm really excited to try an Esper Shell. And then on Arena, we also have Juggernaut Peddler, which isn't a card you have access to in Modern or Legacy or anything like that. So with 4 Grief, 4 Juggernaut Peddler, 4 Ephemerate, that seems like a card that is going to be picking apart the opponent's hand and then snowballing the game in terms of card advantage off cards like Satori as well. So I'm really excited to try that kind of list out. Then next up we got Psychic Frog, which is a pretty powerful card. You know, it might seem kind of unassuming, but this does seem pretty good, right? So when it deals combat damage, it draws a card, so going to snowball card advantage pretty quickly. To give it, you can give it evasion by exiling 3 cards from your graveyard. Obviously in Timeless with fetch lands, that should be pretty easy to enable quite early on, which is just, you know, a way to give this evasion to start getting in. And then even if your opponent does block stuff, you can discard cards to make it bigger. And this is also a repeatable discard outlet. So if you're running a deck that wants to be pitching stuff to the graveyard, this just seems like a nice enabler for that also just snowballs card advantage as well. So there's a lot going on with this card. I think it's generically powerful on its own, but particularly if you want to be, you know, running discard outlets in your deck, this seems like an excellent option to consider as well. Then next up we got Ugin's Labyrinth, and this is one of the scariest cards from this set. This card seems so powerful. So any land that can tap for 2 mana is incredibly powerful. You know, we've seen Sunken Citadel and Lotus Field put in work on Arena. This card can tap for 2 mana on turn 1 and is relatively easy to set up as well, which is very scary. And then the other crazy thing about this card is that even if you don't enable the imprint, this is still just a land that taps for a colorless mana regardless. So if you're not using this to cast Chalice of the Void on 1 or Blood Moon on 2, I don't even think you need to go crazy on having a bunch of colorless cards that cost mana value 7 or greater, really, because even if you don't have one, you can still just play this as a regular land. Obviously, it doesn't tap for colored mana, but if it did, it would probably be one of the best lands ever printed. But this seems absolutely crazy. Now, before Modern Horizons 3 came out, I wasn't 100% sure about this card because there just aren't that many playable colorless cards that cost mana value 7 or greater. We are getting a bunch in this set though, which makes it pretty easy to enable this that I'm going to go over in a second. In terms of home for this, like I said, you know, being able to tap for 2 mana on turn 1 is kind of crazy. So you could run Chalice of the Void, Blood Moon, you know, we've seen these kind of red stompy, or not even stompy, but these kind of decks that try and lock the opponent out of the game very quickly. If you are running that sort of deck, I do think you need to be running a lot of cards that cost mana value 7 or greater, because otherwise, you know, your proactive game plan is probably a little bit too slow. But that's one way you could build it that's kind of seen play in formats like Legacy in the past with Ancient Tomb. But outside of that, I think the home I'm most excited to try this out in is just in a generic ramp shell with the green flare, right? If you run Grazer, Kami, the green flare, you could potentially try and run Forceful Cultivator, but the awkward thing with Cultivator and Labyrinth is that if you have Labyrinth in your opening hand, Cultivator will always cost 4 mana, so I'm not sure that's the best home for Cultivator, but you could just run a ramp deck with Grazer, Kami, the green flare, and then just have a bunch of mana value 7 or greater cards to ramp into, which also enable the Labyrinth. So I'm really excited to try this out in a ramp shell. Seems an incredibly powerful card. Now, in terms of the enablers, the first one I want to highlight here is Devourer of Destiny. So this is a reasonable payoff for ramping, right? If you've got 7 mana, you can cast this and you exile a card when you cast it. So, you know, kind of reminiscent of Cityscape Leveler in a way. And a 6/6 body is pretty decent as well. But it also has this other ability, kind of reminiscent of Once Upon a Time. And we've seen how powerful these kind of opening hand Once Upon a Time effects can be. So if you do have this in your opening hand, it helps just smooth your draws. Obviously, it doesn't replace itself like Once Upon a Time does, but looking at the top 4, that's a big amount, right? This can help you find your Ugin's Labyrinth, you know, if you're on the draw for turn 1 to be able to cast, and then you can imprint it as well. And it's also just a decent payoff for ramping to 7 mana as well. So this seems like a slam dunk 4 of to me in any Ugin's Labyrinth deck, just because, you know, it's a good payoff, and this kind of consistency enabling off the opening hand ability seems really strong as well. Then another really nice enabler for Labyrinth is Nulldrifter, so I love the flavor on this one, it's great. Obviously, Nulldrifter has been wildly unplayable in both formats, really. Oh, and by the way, I don't think Ugin's Labyrinth is going to be legal in Historic. I would be shocked. I think they want to try and keep fast mana and free spells out of the format, so I'm only really going to be talking about Timeless applications here. And obviously, in Timeless, playing a Divination really isn't that good, but the big thing here is it's an enabler for Labyrinth that you can cast before you get to 7 mana. So like I said, casting Divination isn't that great, but to enable the Labyrinth, I absolutely think it's worth running. And then if you do get to 7 mana, you know, a 4/4 flying body isn't nothing. It does have Annihilator 1 as well, so I think with the current card pool that we have available, this is definitely an enabler that I'm going to be running alongside the Labyrinth. Maybe as the rest of the set gets spoiled, there might be a better alternative, and obviously as future sets come out, this is one of the cards that I'll be considering cutting, but currently I definitely think this is worth running if you want to enable the Labyrinth. Speaking of which, I think probably the best enabler for Ugin's Labyrinth is Drowner of Truth. So this is a really sweet card because it's an MDFC, so you can play it as a land, and you can also imprint it to Ugin's Labyrinth. So even if the actual card here didn't really do much, just being a land that you can imprint to the Labyrinth is probably good enough to be playable. So this is a slam dunk 4 of in Labyrinth, but the body itself is okay, right? It's a 7/6 that also produces some Eldrazi's that can produce more mana, you know, the majority of the time, because I imagine you're going to be using Labyrinth to ramp into this, but this is just an excellent enabler because, you know, the floor of this is just play it as a tap land that can produce both colors. Speaking of which, we are getting a bunch of extra MDFCs in this set. This is one of a cycle that is tap lands. I believe we're getting 1 for each of the color combinations. Now, I'm not going to go over every single one of these because, you know, I think the main reason that you would want to run these is if you're running a deck like Charbelcher where you don't want to run any actual lands, for example. So I do think this is the best of the bunch because of Labyrinth. I'm not going to go over all of them. But other cards, other MDFCs that I am excited for, first of all, is Disciple of Freyalise. So like I said, I think getting more MDFCs is going to be a really big deal for the Charbelcher deck, because I think the big weakness of that deck is that if you stick in the colors, so in Timeless it's going to be green-black, you only have access to 8 untapped lands, which is a really big deal. Now, obviously, having to take 3 damage off all of your lands is a concern, and this card, you know, is an untapped green land that, you know, same thing as Turn Timber Symbiosis, pay 3 life and it can enter untapped, but getting an extra land that you can play untapped is a huge deal for that deck, because having to play tap lands was a really big drawback. So first of all, these are just going to go straight into the Charbelcher deck. Now, we've only got 2 of these untapped lands, so I'm not 100% sure if there's a cycle. We've got the green one and the white one so far. If you get the black one, that's going to be really, really big for the Charbelcher deck in terms of consistency. But outside of that, another home I'm excited to try this out is, as I mentioned earlier, I'm excited to try Forceful Cultivator, and this alongside Turn Timber Symbiosis enables you to cast Cultivator very consistently, which you can then use with the Flare to ramp even quicker. And then the card itself is, you know, it does have impact on the game. It is 6 mana, which is quite a lot, but you're typically going to be running this, if you're not running it in Belcher, in kind of a ramp shell. And, you know, if you are running bigger creatures, like if you're running this in Devotion and Historic, for example, you can use this to sacrifice like an Old Growth Troll and draw a bunch of cards, and then you get the Old Growth Troll on one of your lands. Seems pretty interesting. And then, you know, if you're running Elves, this seems like a slam dunk 4 of there as well, which is, particularly if you're running Eladrami, is a creature that you can either cast off the top if you have a bunch of mana, or cheat into play off the Eladrami as well, which seems pretty good. So this card seems good if you're running Belcher, if you're running Elves, if you're running Forceful Cultivator. And then I think this one is just generically more useful. So this is kind of, same as the, I can't remember the name of the current white one that we've got access to. So the current one is like 7 mana, produces 2 Angels. This one seems a lot better because it's just a lot cheaper, and being able to destroy an artifact or enchantment is pretty big. Now, I'm not sure exactly what decks will be interested in this, right? You can make the argument for a control deck wanting this sort of effect, but control decks in Timeless and Historic to an extent want to be running a lot of blue lands for Counterspell, Mana Drain, and Archmage's Charm, so I'm not really sure it fits there, but this seems like just the opportunity cost of this is pretty low if you're running just a mono white or a 2-color white deck. So this is definitely a card that I could seeing play in the main deck of some decks, if they just want to have extra threat density and they don't really care too much about paying 3 life. Another really interesting thing about these cards as well is that it's a fetchable untapped land. Now, I've been running, Grizzled Huntmaster in a few decks like the Naya Winota deck as well, and I've had to run the tapped MDFCs, so this is just a nice upgrade there. You could potentially run this as, Witch Enchanter in the sideboard of Winota as both an untapped white source and a way to take out artifacts and enchantments as well, which seems pretty nice. But yeah, MDFC is very big for Charbelcher and could just be used, in a number of decks if you're interested in the other side as well. So we're also getting a bunch of new big Eldrazi in this set, which is always exciting. Now, to be honest, I've not been massively impressed with any of them so far outside of the Emrakul. There are some smaller ones that I'm going to talk about later in the video, but the bigger ones like Kozilek and Ulamog, I just feel like we have better options. Like, they're cool cards for sure, but I just don't think they're better than a lot of the other options that we've got right now. This Emrakul, the World Anew, though, does interest me. I think the ability itself on this card is very strong, but the ability to cast this for 6 colorless mana off Madness is very appealing. Now, I think the one big difference between Modern and Timeless and Historic is we don't have the Underworld Cookbook, which is probably the best discard outlet for this in colorless. So I do think to be able to cast this early consistently, you do need to be running basically all colorless lands. You can run colored lands if you run the Pain lands, right? I think the best color for discard outlets is probably red. So you could run a bunch of the red Pain lands that also tap for colorless as a way to enable this potentially. But this does feel like a kind of a sleeper card to me anyway. I mean, there could very well be a deck that could enable this, but this feels more of a card where as we get better discard outlets, as we get better ways to produce multiple colorless mana, this seems like a really powerful card. So again, I'm definitely going to be trying this with, Pain lands and discard outlets initially, but I wouldn't be surprised if this is a card that isn't great immediately, but as we get more enablers, gets very strong. Now, next up, we have a bunch of very cheap creatures that can transform into Planeswalkers, which is really exciting. So starting off here with 1 mana Grist. So having Death Touch on a 1-drop does mean that even if you don't get to flip it, it does have an impact on the board. So the floor of this card is already pretty good. And then if we bring a creature back from our graveyards, we can pay green and then flip it over to Grist the Plague Swarm, which seems pretty good. So enters with 3 loyalty. You can plus to produce tokens and mill, and then you basically make Death Touch tokens as long as you mill black cards, which, I presume you're going to be running this in a black-green deck most likely because black is the best color to get stuff back from your graveyard. The ability to destroy artifacts and enchantments is pretty big as well. Now, obviously, this card on its face isn't the most powerful card ever, but coming from a 1-mana creature, right, this is a 2-mana investment off a 1-mana creature is insane. I think if you can flip this, you're getting such good value off it. Now, in terms of enablers for this, I think there are a decent number of mid-range enablers for it. Like, we recently got Jet Collector, and I think, replaying cards from your graveyard with Jet Collector is a really good way to flip it. You've obviously got stuff like Bloodghast that you can get back if you're running it in a Sacrifice Shell. You can run Unearth. Lurrus as well is another way that you can bring it back. So in mid-range shells, I could see this being good as just a 1-mana good value creature. We are getting Nethergoyf though, so we're kind of spoilt for options for mid-range decks right now, but maybe if you want to move away from the bigger mid-range decks towards Lurrus stuff, then this is definitely a shoe in there, especially because recasting it with Lurrus is really powerful. I also think it's a very interesting Chord of Calling target, specifically in Yawgmoth, because bringing back Young Wolf from the graveyard is a way to trigger this. Now, again, you would need a sacrifice outlet, which would most likely be a Yawgmoth, or, I guess you could chump block with it as well. So I definitely think I'm going to be trying this out as a one-off in Yawgmoth as well. But this is a very, very powerful card, and, a card that I only expect to get better once we get more recursive creatures to the format as well. Then next up we got Ajani, Nacatl, Pariah. So again, I think the floor of this card is pretty good, right? You get For 2 mana, you get a 1/2 and a 2/1, which is already pretty reasonable for stats. And then, the opponent is very incentivized not to block or attack into your cat, because then when one or more cats dies, you exile it into this Planeswalker here, which does seem pretty decent, right? You 0 to create tokens, and you can buff them with the +2, and then the -4 is pretty powerful as well. So, again, this seems like a card similar to Grist, where the floor is pretty decent. It kind of warps how the game is played, especially if the opponent is trying to win by attacking, because it makes it very difficult for them. Now, in order to enable the flipping more consistently, you would need to be running Sacrifice Outlets. But again, I think this is probably a card where the floor is good enough, and the opponent not being able to attack or block your cats is a good enough incentive. It kind of warps the game state around it, if that makes sense. So this is another card that I think is going to be very powerful. In terms of homes for it, I can't really think of any specific decks that really benefit from this, but again, I think it's just a generically powerful enough card that if you're after just a good 2-mana threat, this seems pretty good to me. Then next up, we got Sorin of House Markov. So I really like this one. So got Lifelink and Extort, which is, pretty nice upside. And then if you gain 3 or more life, at the beginning of your post-combat main phase, you flip it into this Sorin Ravenous Neonate. Again, it keeps the Extort, which is nice. You can +2 to create a food, -1 to deal damage to any target, equal to the amount of life you gain this turn. So that's pretty nice. You gain 3, you flip it, you can immediately -1 to Lightning Bolt a creature or just go face, which is pretty nice. And then if you gain a bunch of life in a turn, you can use this as kind of like a combo finisher, which is pretty nice. And then the -6, gain control of target creatures. So in terms of homes for this, I definitely think in Timeless, I'm very, very excited to play this in Sultai, because the curve of going Sorin on turn 2 into Uro on turn 3, gain 3 life, ramp, flip it, kill a creature off the minus seems really sick. It's also very reminiscent of Oko, which is another card that I think goes very well alongside this, right? You cast a Sorin, cast Oko, make your food, sack the food, flip this, and then you've got, two Planeswalkers that can plus to make food. You can plus to make food off the Sorin, then plus the Oko to turn that food into a creature. You can use this as a removal spell. So I think Sultai is going to be very, very interested in this sort of card. And I do think as the format, I think the format's likely to get less combo focused because of grief and mana drain and stuff like that. So I think the space is going to open up more for Sultai and similar mid-range decks to excel again. Obviously, there are a bunch of other decks that could be interested in this if they have life gain synergies, but that's definitely the place I'm going to be starting with this card. Then we've got Tamiyo, Inquisitive Student, another 1-mana card. As I said with Grist, the ability to get these 1-mana creatures is so impactful, right? These Planeswalkers on these 1-mana creatures might seem kind of low impact in themselves, but getting this value off a 1-mana creature seems insane. So this is a 0/3 flying creature. It's a wizard, which is very important. I'm going to talk about that in a second. And whenever it attacks, you investigate. So, kind of a snowball-y value card. And then once you draw your 3rd card in a turn, you can flip it over to this Planeswalker. +2 isn't that impactful, right? It's good at defending yourself, which is nice. And then you can rebuy instants and sorceries with it. So I think this is going to be at its best in either a control or a tempo deck, right? Because you want to be able to utilize the -3 efficiently, and also the +2 is better when you're playing more of a defensive role in the matchup. But I mean, the great thing with this in Timeless is that you can just immediately flip it with Brainstorm, which is huge, right? You just cast Brainstorm on turn 2, flip it straight away, which is very powerful. Outside of that, like I said, it is a wizard as well, so in Timeless, this is a potential card you could run alongside Snapcaster Mage, Tyrannus Tidebinder to enable Flame of Anor, and potentially the blue Flare as well. This could be a potential card. Obviously, you're not thrilled to sacrifice this, but if you need a free counterspell, it's a 1-drop. Especially if you've already got some clue tokens off the investigating, you're pretty happy to sacrifice it. In terms of historic, obviously flipping this does become more difficult there, but a deck like Is It Phoenix that's, running Faithless Looting alongside Consider an Ops can flip this fairly consistently. Again, I think there are probably better options in Phoenix. I think Dragon's Rage Channeler and Symmetry Sage are probably better, unless you're playing a more controlling shell, in which case this might be worth a look. But yeah, I think this card is a really interesting card. I think, especially alongside Brainstorm, in kind of a controlling deck, being able to utilize this -3 seems really nice there. So if you wanted to run, so I think the best home for it, in my opinion, is probably a Wizards sub-theme control deck where you've got this Snapcaster Mage Tidebinder with Flame of Anor as well, and then you can just use this to either keep producing card advantage every single turn, or protect yourself and then start rebuying your powerful instants and sorceries. And then the last one, I think, yeah, this is the last one, Realm Monsoon Mage. So this is probably the least, or the card I'm least excited for out of this cycle. So kind of another Goblin Electromancer style effect, where it discounts your instants and sorceries by 1. Now, in both formats, I don't think that's really that impactful, right? Storm in Timeless is all about Dark Rituals, so you don't really get much benefit off the discount here. And the same thing in Historic, there's not really too much bonuses you get out of this. And then, so I think if you wanted to run this, it would mainly be either because it's a wizard or because it can flip into this Planeswalker here. So it is also a wizard itself, which is worth mentioning. But again, you know, we have so many options, even in Historic Is It Wizards, that I don't think this one's likely to get a look in. And then the Planeswalker side is pretty interesting. So that I guess the whole idea here is that you might chain a bunch of instants and sorceries together, and then you can flip it and deal a bunch of damage off the Planeswalker side. Again, this is a very cool card, but I just don't really think it has a good home in Historic or Explorer. I think this could be an interesting card if red-based Storm becomes more of a thing again. But again, the fact you deal damage to yourself potentially off the coin flips might mean that it's just straight up worse than Boral or a Goblin Electromancer anyway. So this is a cool card, but I don't have high hopes for it in either format, to be honest. Then next up we got Priest of Titania, and this is a huge addition for Elves. So I've been testing a bunch of different Elves decks in Historic. I've not really tried too much in Timeless. I know obviously Natural Order and Allosaurus Shepherd and Chalice of the Void have been experimented with a bit, but in Historic, which is where Elves is the better deck, I think, I've always wanted Priest of Titania because of Tyvar. So when I tried Tyvar after it came out, Elves is one of the first homes that I tried, and the deck felt really strong, but the big issue was that you couldn't recast the Elvish Archdruid off Tyvar. The fact that you can now go Tyvar -2, hit Priest of Titania, immediately tap it for a bunch of mana is so strong. So I'm really, really excited to be trying, kind of Golgari Elves with Tyvar in Historic. In terms of Timeless, again, I think Elves is going to struggle against Orcish Bowmasters and now Fury as well. Again, I'm going to try it because Natural Order is one of the best cards in the format. Priest of Titania is a significant upgrade for the archetype as well, but I'm mainly excited for this in Historic, where Elves has been, traditionally a very strong best of one deck over the years, and I think this alongside Tyvar really increases the speed of the deck by quite a lot. So, and you've obviously also got a ton of extra options, like we got the new 3-drop that allowed, like the Eladrami, that allows you to cast cards off the top of your library and cheat Crater Hoofs into play. So I'm really excited to play Elves with Priest of Titania. And then another card that we're getting as well is Wirewood Symbiote as well, which I understand it's not an Elf itself, but I do know it does see play in like Legacy Elves, for example. Now I'm not 100% sure if we have all the tools for this to be as effective on Arena. But it's a nice option to have, especially off Chord of Calling, if bouncing Elves is something that you're interested in, particularly if you've got stuff like Elvish Visionary, for example, then this is a nice option. But out of the two cards, I think Priest of Titania is the much bigger upgrade for Elves in general. Then we've got Kappa Cannoneer, which is a huge addition to Artifact Synergy decks. Now, we haven't really had any Artifact Synergy decks in Timeless. I think, trying to port the ones from Historic over are just generally too slow. Obviously, in Historic, we do have a number of Artifact Synergy decks. My main concern with this is that I just don't know if we have good enough enablers for it. I have tried builds in the past, in Historic at least, where you have for Springleaf Drum, for Moonsnow Prototype as ways to really accelerate. And, for Thought Monitor, for Kappa Cannoneer could be nice as top end there. So out of the two formats, if this is legal in Historic, I'm much more excited for this in Historic, just because I feel like there aren't too many good enablers. But yeah, if you can consistently cast this early, Ward 4 is enormous. Like, that's going to be so, basically hex proof against, in the vast majority of situations, I think. And then this just scales so quickly. This is such a fast and efficient way to close games out. So I do think this is going to have a pretty big impact in Historic, where Artifact decks are already about. Again, we don't have Mox Opal, so if the format does significantly speed up with the release of MH3, which I expect it to do, there's a chance that the enablers just aren't good enough for Kappa Cannoneer. Again, I think it's probably too slow for Timeless. And the other big issue with these Artifact Synergy decks is that if they are popular and they're a known entity, it's very easy to sideboard against them. There's 1,000,001 cards that just completely hose the artifact decks. We're getting Meltdown in this set, which I'm not going to cover because it basically fills the exact same role as a Brotherhood Zen or a Divine Purge or, you know, a Bifrost or something like that. So I definitely think this is a card that has the potential. This is by far and away the best finisher in Artifact Synergy decks. I'm just not sure we have good enough enablers in Timeless, and I think once it's a known deck, it's going to be quite easy to sideboard against in Historic, but very powerful card. So next up we got Winter Moon, which is a really interesting kind of Blood Moon style effect. Now, there is obviously a very, very big deck building restriction with this card. You do need to be running basically all basics for this to not hurt you. So either a mono-colored deck or potentially a two-colored deck if you have a lot of fetch lands to get your basics, for example. But the fact that this is 2 mana as opposed to 3 and you can get it down a turn sooner is such a big deal. Getting your hate cards down earlier, you know, especially if you're on the play and you get this down on turn 2, it can be so punishing. And it's obviously not, you know, it's colorless, so you can run it in decks that aren't red or blue. My big concern with this card, though, is that I feel with the printing of the new blue Merfolk Blood Moon and this card as well, that people are going to be fetching, or at least they should be fetching their basics early on. And if people are fetching their basics early on, then this doesn't, like, obviously it's still going to have an impact later in the game, but I'm not sure the juice is worth the squeeze with this card, considering how restrictive the deck building constraints are on your deck, for example. So I feel if people aren't proactively fetching their basics early on, this will be great. If they are, I'm not sure it's really worth it, because you lose out on so much utility in your mana base if you just run all basics for this, if that makes sense. Then next up we got White of the Reliquary, which I love the flavor on this card. It's so sweet. And this card is significantly better than Knight of the Reliquary as well. So obviously it's a mana cheaper, which is a huge deal, but this also ramps you, right? Knight of the Reliquary sacrifices lands for lands. This sacrifices creatures for lands. So if you cast this on turn 2, activate it, you then have 4 lands in play going into your turn 3, which is really big. And you can also search any lands, so this seems great with Field of the Dead. You've obviously got a bunch of utility options like Bojuka Bog as well. This seems very, very nice with Colony Garden as well, right? You play Colony Garden, get a token, sacrifice it, get another Colony Garden, sacrifice that token, get another land. So that's kind of like a self-contained engine. Obviously that is quite slow, but you know, that's some way that you can use it. Outside of that, you do obviously need to have some other sacrifice fodder, so you could run this in a sacrifice deck with stuff like Bloodghast. You could maybe run it alongside Goblin Bombardment maybe, and Forsaken Miner, although I'm not really sure that goes too well, but you basically need to have some sacrifice fodder. I think this is great with Colony Garden. Again, it could be too slow potentially, but if you can back this up, you know, if you're running it alongside Grief and Thoughtseize to cut the faster combo decks off their game plan, and then use this to just snowball the game and eventually get Field of Dead online, that seems very powerful to me. So this is a card that I'm super excited to build around, but probably doesn't have an immediate home straight away. Then next up we got Volatile Stormdrake, which is another card that I'm pretty excited for. So basically this is a 2-mana creature that exchanges control with another creature, and if it's a bigger creature like an Atraxa or something like that, then it sacrifices, so it's kind of like a removal spell in that way. But if it's 4 mana value or lower, then you get to keep the creature. So obviously giving the opponent a 3/2 flyer that has hexproof from activated and triggered abilities isn't ideal, but you do get, if you get to consistently keep the opponent's creature, that is pretty sweet. So obviously there's a bunch of creatures in the format, you know, Yawgmoth, Jarsil, Jet Collector, that are really good to take control of, that are cheaper. And then obviously, you know, a 2-mana way to just get rid of bigger creatures is pretty nice as well. So this is a sweet card. I'm just not really sure that it's going to be better than a lot of other options. The main 2 ways that the main 2 decks that I would be looking in this card for are Chord of Calling decks. Being able to chord for 2 and just either take control or get rid of a bigger creature seems very, very nice. So I think even though Yawgmoth, I guess Yawgmoth does sometimes splash blue for Test of Talents now. I don't know if they'll still do that with Show and Tell not being as popular, but if you're running Chord of Calling, I like running this there as well. And if you are somehow running a mono blue deck, I don't know why you would in either format, to be honest. This does seem like a good way to get rid of bigger creatures that mono blue typically struggles with, but you know, in most decks, I think you would probably be more interested in like a traditional removal spell. But if you're running Chord, if you're running mono blue, this seems like a really nice option there. So next up we've got Power Balance, which is basically just Counterbalance but in red, which is pretty interesting. So I'm not really sure there's much you get in red. Like I still think you would probably want to run this alongside blue, because I think this is only really good if you have a lot of ways to manipulate the top of your library, and the only really good way we have of doing that, especially in Timeless, is Brainstorm. So I think if you're running this card, you would want to be running it alongside blue anyway for Brainstorm. I don't believe red has great library manipulation, to be honest. If there's a card in red that you wouldn't want to run alongside blue that you can think of that would be good alongside Power Balance, definitely let me know in the comments, because this feels like a card that I might be missing something with. But my main concern with this card in general is that I just don't feel like there's good enough library manipulation. The only two cards I can really think of are Brainstorm and Dragon's Rage Channeler. But, with Channeler, you would need to manipulate top of your library in response to an opponent's spell. You would need to be casting stuff at instant speed, which doesn't really work with cantrips, because cantrips usually clear the top of your library. So Brainstorm is the only real one that works. We are getting a new kind of version of Brainstorm in this set that's 3 mana, draw 4, put 2 back. But the difference between 3 mana and 1 mana is so huge. So I feel like this is a card that I expect to be good at some point, but I just don't really feel like we have good enough library manipulation for this to be good right now. And especially in Historic, where we don't have access to Brainstorm, I'm not really sure this is going to be good enough, unless there's, definitely let me know if there's some library manipulation cards that I'm missing, because this does feel like a card where if there is enough, this card is going to be good, but I'm just not sure there is enough right now. Then next up, we're going to have a look at some of the energy cards. So if you haven't noticed, there is kind of like an energy sub-theme with a lot of these cards going on in the set. As I mentioned earlier, I'm very, very excited for Tune the Narrative alongside the new 2-mana Dinosaur that we get to allow us to potentially, go turn 2 Dino into a Minskamboo or a 1 Ring, for example. But if you are running an energy deck, this does seem like a really nice option, as well as a Tune to Aether. Another new payoff that we get for energy is Wrath of the Skies. So this is a really nice card because, you can start getting really good use of this without that much energy, right? If you go Tune the Narrative on turn 1, you can cast this on turn 2 and it will wipe the entire board of 2 mana stuff and less. So against a Lurrus deck, that basically just kills everything. And then obviously, as you get access to more and more mana, you don't even need the energy spare. You can just cast this straight away. So if you are interested in this card, I think, especially if you're like a blue-white control deck of some sort, Tune the Narrative alongside Wrath of the Skies seems like a really nice way to just wipe the board. Again, I'm not sure it's really going to be a main deck card. I think Divine Purge does a pretty similar thing. Although, to be fair, Divine Purge does give the opponent the option to recast it later, so this could be a potential option that you run there instead. But either way, this seems like a pretty interesting combination to me. Then another energy payoff we've got is Unstable Amulet. So ETB gets 2 energy, and then you can tap it and pay 2 energy to exile top card of your library. And you can exile it basically until you exile another card, which is pretty nice. So unlike a lot of the kind of Reckless Impulse style effects in red, this just stays there forever. You don't need to, cast. You don't have the end of the turn or the end of the next turn as a restriction, which is pretty sweet. By the way, Skyfall's got this wrong. It's pay 2 energy here instead of pay 2 colorless mana. But if you have ways to consistently produce energy, this does seem like a pretty nice card advantage tool. You also ping the opponent when you cast cards from exile, which is pretty nice. And this could potentially this part here could be nice as a finisher, if you have some kind of Storm deck where you're casting the majority of your cards from exile, like if you have like an Electromancer style effect and you're just playing a bunch of Reckless Impulses and Questing Druids as a way to keep storming off. This seems like a nice way to just finish the opponent off, which is nice. So this definitely feels like a card that you could run in energy decks as a payoff. Could be a sideboard card as a way to produce card advantage, or, I could just see it being good enough if you are producing a ton of excess energy as just a way to grind into longer games. So if you're running an energy style deck, this seems like a good option. Maybe sideboard, maybe main deck, depending on the metagame. Then we're getting the medallions. So this is just the red one, but we get it in every single color. So they're all 2 mana artifacts, and they reduce the color of all those spells by 1 less. So this is obviously a very powerful effect. I'm not sure we really have the best ways to utilize this. Obviously, in older formats, like Legacy, for example, you have Storm decks that utilize this, where you can make your 2 mana Storm cards, your mana producers cost less. Storm, in Historic has kind of existed with Burgi and Questing Druid and Dragon's Rage Channeler and stuff like that. This could be good there because then you can cast all of your impulse effects for 1 mana, which is pretty nice. But the main thing I'm excited for this in Historic is Grinning Ignis, because this is a card that can reduce the cost of Ignis. So this plus Ignis is basically just infinite ETBs. So as long as you have some kind of win condition alongside it, it's pretty nice. So this is just a nice option to run alongside Ignis. Now again, in Historic, I'm always a little bit worried about 3-card combos that involve artifacts because of Flame of Anor. Even with MH3, I'm sure Wizards will still be playable in some form, which is a bit of a concern there. So that's where I mainly see it in Historic. Until we get more actual Storm cards, I think this is mainly a home for Grinning Ignis or, maybe Burgy style decks. In Timeless, the majority of the Storm decks are all Dark Ritual decks, which don't really benefit from these sorts of effects. So I think for the most part, unless I'm missing something, I imagine these medallions will be good maybe in Historic for those Storm decks that I mentioned, but will mainly be sleeper cards until further stuff gets added. Again, this is another bunch of cards where I feel like I could be missing something. So if you've got good ideas for how to utilize these medallions in either Historic or Timeless, definitely let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear what you guys are planning with these. And then next up, we got Flage Titan of Fire's Fury. So we're getting another, Uro Croxer style Titan in this set. And it's a 3-mana Lightning Helix. So basically 3-mana Helix wherever, and then you can escape it, and it helixes on ETB and attack, which is pretty nice. So I think Uro is definitely better than this in my opinion, because it's just better proactively. It's good at stabilizing. Drawing a card and ramping is largely better than just using Helix, but I do think this has the potential to be better than Croxer. Now in terms of what decks you want to play this in, this does seem pretty interesting in Burn to me. I think there's definitely a tension in both Timeless and Historic if you're playing Boros Burn, because you'd need to give up Lurrus to run this, but this seems so powerful in longer games in Burn, right? The big issue with Burn is that you kind of run out of gas a little bit, and especially in Historic, where the format is just generally lower power level and the games go on a little bit longer. This seems really powerful there, because, the big issue with Burn there is that, you tend to start off the game really quickly, but can often run out of gas a little bit. And additionally, if Wizards does continue to be a very popular deck, this seems fantastic against Wizards as well, right? They really struggle against Lightning Helix. So, Helix one of their creatures, and then I'm sure by the time you actually cast this, or by the time the game goes long, you can start escaping it. And once you escape it, Flame of Anor doesn't kill it. It kills a creature on ETB. It kills a creature every time you attack. So definitely excited for this one in Historic. In Timeless, I still think it's going to be playable for sure, but when the format's a little bit faster and there's more fast combo decks, I'm a little bit less high on it there. And obviously Uro is legal as well, which I think is probably the better card, but I think this is going to be an absolute all-star in Historic, if it's legal. I assume it will be. Then next up, we've got a couple of new goblins that I'm very excited for. So starting off with Mog Mob. So this is basically a 3-mana 3/3 that you can sack to deal 3 damage as you choose. And this is very big because I think specifically Muxus versions of goblins, again, this is mainly for Historic rather than Timeless, but Muxus versions of goblins have really struggled to interact with the opponent quickly enough while still running a high enough goblin count for Muxus. The big card that was a huge bonus to improving that in the past was Munitions Expert, which I still think is a great card, but this seems like an excellent addition to Muxus Goblins, where you can cast this on turn 3 and just kill something straight away, right? I think the biggest issue with Muxus Goblins has been decks like Wizards that just race you, and if you bring Fatal Push in, your Muxus hits become a lot worse, whereas here you can cast Mog Mob, sack it to kill a Dreadhorde Arcanist or a Symmetry Sage, and you can also hit it off Muxus as well. And then the other thing I'm really excited for with this is with Agatha's Soul Cauldron, because using this with Soul Cauldron, giving all of your smaller goblins the ability to sacrifice themselves to deal 3 to any target, especially if you have a way to give counters to all your creatures like a Metallic Mimic or a Grumgully, for example, can just enable you to one-shot the opponent out of nowhere, which is huge. And Agatha's Soul Cauldron Goblins is a deck I've been working on in the background for a while now, and it's felt very close to being good. I've been very excited about Krenko with Agatha's Soul Cauldron, because if you go, you've obviously got Artillery Enthusiast, which is a goblin and can pitch Krenko and Mog Mob and stuff to the graveyard to enable it to be activated with Soul Cauldron on turn 2. There's also First Day of Class, which you can use to discard Krenko, and then all of your creatures this turn get +1/+1 counters. So if you Soul Cauldron Krenko, you basically just have infinite tokens, right? You give the creature that you've got Krenko's ability, activate it, produce 2 tokens that enter with +1/+1 counters because of First Day of Class. You can then activate both of those for Krenko as well. So I definitely am happy and really excited to go back to Soul Cauldron Goblins with Mog Mob. And then additionally, another card that kind of fits both of those style of Goblins decks as well is Warren's Soul Trader. So this is another goblin that can sack goblins to produce treasure tokens, which on its face is very, very powerful anyway. I'm sure there's a bunch of 3-card combos that work very well with this, but this is another card that just enables you to ramp into Muxus super effectively, and again, works very well with Soul Cauldron. This is a very nice ability to have you know, if you do use Soul Cauldron with it. But I think out of the two, I'm more excited for this as a way to ramp into Muxus, which is pretty big. So 2 very nice additions for Goblins. Again, I think these are cards that will much more likely see play in Historic, because Goblins hasn't really seen any play at all in Timeless, but very, very excited to play with these in Historic. Then next up, we got Emperor of Bones, which is a very nice, you know, way to reanimate creatures from your graveyard. Now, this is kind of reminiscent of Jet Collector, which is a card we got quite recently, and I think Jet Collector is probably better immediately, but the big deal with Emperor of Bones is that this is very good at reanimating bigger creatures. So, you know, with Jet Collector, you obviously have to pay for the mana cost of stuff up front, whereas this, you know, you adapt it and you can just reanimate like an Atraxa or an Griselbrand or something like that. Now, you do sacrifice it, so it's kind of similar to Goryo's Vengeance in that way, so I think the targets, if you are reanimating something big with this that you want to look for, are probably Griselbrand and Atraxa. And again, we've already got, you know, much more efficient answers to be able to reanimate, you know, in Reanimate and Persist. The obvious big difference there is that Persist doesn't work with Atraxa and Griselbrand. So if you do want to reanimate Atraxa, you could potentially run Reanimate and Emperor of Bones as, like, you know, another option to utilize there potentially. But very interesting card. It does, you know, it does seem quite powerful. And if you do want to reanimate Atraxa instead of using Persist, this seems like a you know, a decent alternative. But again, I think Persist is just much more efficient at what it's doing. So I think Persist decks will probably be better than Emperor of Bones, but a very nice card to have access to as well. Then next up, we've got Marionette Apprentice, which is a pretty interesting card. The main reason I'm highlighting this is because it basically fills the role of a Blood Artist, but it also fabricates. So I think this could be worth considering in a deck like Yawgmoth, or like a Chord of Calling sacrifice style deck where you care about having this as a finisher, because it says whenever you sacrifice another creature or artifact, the opponent loses 1 life. So this is a really good way to close games out. And the fact that it fabricates means that it also puts another creature into play if you want, which then makes Chord of Calling slightly easier to achieve. So if you are running a deck that wants a Blood Artist style effect and you're running Chord of Calling, this is definitely one that's worth considering. Then next up, we got 6, which is basically just another value 3-drop, right? This is kind of reminiscent of, again, Jet Collector. Now, this does enable you to recast Mishra's Bauble immediately, so you can get value the turn it comes down, but this does just seem kind of slow and mopey to me. I think I'd probably be more excited to play this one in Historic than Timeless, where the format's a little bit slower, but again, I feel like Jet Collector is probably just better. It's a mana cheaper, which means you can play it alongside Lurrus. It's not legendary, so you can have it in multiples, which is very important when you're replaying Jet Collector with Jet Collector. So I feel like with Jet Collector getting printed recently, this card is kind of, you know, not as good unless you really value the mill on this. So pretty interesting card, but I think there are probably better options. So next up, we got Basking Broodscale, which is a pretty interesting alternative to Scurry Oak. So Scurry Oak has a couple of combos on Arena. First of all, you've got the life gain combo with Heliod, and you've also got the combo with Rosie. And this card is basically a mana cheaper and can replicate both of those combos, which is really sick. Out of the two, I definitely think I'm more excited for this alongside Rosie, because it's only a 2-card combo and they curve into each other as well. You can cast Broodscale on 2, into Rosie on 3, and then just combo off, which is really nice. My main concern with this, though, is that the tokens it creates are 0/1s. So say you're running this in place of Scurry Oak in the life gain combo in Historic, for example, you don't actually win the game the following turn, right? Scurry Oak produces infinite 1/1s, which means that, you know, you can just attack around whatever the opponent's got. This makes infinite 0/1s. So unless you have a way to utilize the infinite mana that you get off this, it doesn't enable you to win the following turn. And to be honest, I think the Scurry Oak combos have kind of been usurped by the other sacrifice-based, or the other combos like Samwise and Amalia, because the big thing with both of those decks is they can run good backup game plans, because there's a lot of stuff that synergizes well with Amalia. There's a lot of stuff that synergizes well with Samwise and the Sacrifice Shell. So I feel like the overall deck in these Scurry Oak or Broodscale decks are a little bit worse. And the fact that this produces 0/1s instead of 1/1s does mean that you then need an extra step. You then need a way to utilize the infinite colorless mana in order to win the game. So this is a notable addition for combos, but I don't really see this seeing much play, even in Historic, to be honest. Then next up, we've got a really nice reprint in Flusterstorm. So this is the first time that we're getting this on Arena. I don't think this is going to be a main deck card, but you know, if you're playing a blue deck and Storm combo specifically is a common thing, then this seems like a really nice option to have access to. So again, you know, not sure how much play this will see immediately, but very nice card to have access to in your sideboard. The next up we got Chthonian Nightmare, which I guess is meant to be like a rebalanced version of Recurring Nightmare. But I do think this is significantly worse in that you have to pay the mana to reanimate the creature. I haven't played with Recurring Nightmare, but my understanding of why that card is powerful is because you can use it to reanimate really big creatures. The fact that you have to pay the mana cost of the creature with this, and in addition to, having enough energy to be able to do it as well, does make me think that this is probably just going to be too slow, right? You're looking at this as kind of like a value card, in which case I think a card like Jet Collector is probably better. Now again, this is less resilient to removal than Jet Collector, so if you're interested in that style of effect, this could be an interesting option. But again, it's pretty slow. It relies on using the graveyards, and you have to sacrifice a creature to activate it as well. So I thought it was worth talking about because it is kind of a rebalanced version of a very iconic card, but I just don't think it's good enough. If you didn't have to pay X to bring the creature back, then I would be much, much higher on this card. But as a value card, I think it's probably just a little bit too slow. So next up, we got Frogmere Enforcer. So we're getting more affinity payoffs here, which is pretty nice, because that is somewhere that I felt like the artifact decks on Arena have always been lacking in the past. Having said that, I think Kappa Cannoneer is just a much, much better card than this, and you can't run too many payoffs. I'd much rather get a card like Thoughtcast instead, because, presumably you're going to be running 4 Thought Monitor, 4 Kappa Cannoneer, and a bunch of cheap artifacts. You could potentially run this as another payoff if you wanted, because it is better than the next best option, right? I think there is a 7 mana affinity for artifacts card on Arena already, but the fact that you can prototype and cast this, earlier if you're running red mana is pretty nice. Again, I don't expect this one to have much of an impact, but I thought it was worth mentioning because we are getting more affinity payoffs in this set. The next up is White Orchid Phantom, which is a pretty interesting card that's just good at hating out any non-basic lands. So this is going to be good against... Well, I'm not sure it's going to be great against Field of the Dead if it's against Primeval Titan, because they're very good at, very quickly getting multiples in play. But if there is specific non-basic lands that you're worried about, Ugin's Labyrinth is particularly good to destroy because you also get to get rid of the card they imprinted. This seems pretty nice. So I imagine this is mostly going to be a sideboard card if like Ugin's Labyrinth decks take off, or maybe Fairfield of the Dead decks see more play, or if we get more powerful non-basic lands in this set that you want to be able to hate out. This seems like a very nice sideboard card. I could even see this seeing play in the main deck potentially, because there are some Death and Taxes style decks, and this is a pretty good way of just cutting the opponent off certain colors as well, right? If you're up against a multicolored deck, you use this to take out one of their triomes, force them to get a basic. You could potentially run them out of basics as well with this if they're not careful enough in deck building. So this is definitely a card I expect to see play in some sideboards and potentially some main decks depending on the metagame as well. The next up, we got another land here in Barbarian Ring, which is basically just an upgraded version of Ramunap Ruins. I think it's going to be very easy to get 7 or more cards in your graveyard, and having to only pay red instead of paying 4 extra mana is a huge upgrade over Ramunap Ruins. So if you're running Burn, you run 4 of these, I'm pretty sure. Really nice addition to Burn decks. The next up, we got Kozilek's Unsealing, which is a card that I've been thinking about quite a lot, and I just don't think this card is very good. I think even in Historic, the power level of a card that's 3 mana and doesn't do anything the turn it comes down needs to be insanely high. So I think there's 2 main ways that you could utilize this. First of all is if you're cheating into play creatures with mana value 7 or higher, which is kind of why I wanted to highlight Frogmere Enforcer, right? If you have a bunch of affinity cards and you have this in play beforehand, you can potentially draw an insane amount of cards, but again, I feel like Kappa Cannoneer is good enough to close the game out. Thought Monitor draws cards by itself, and Frogmere Enforcer and the other affinity card doesn't really seem that great. And again, this is a 3 mana do nothing the turn it comes down. The other way I can see this being utilized is if you cast this on turn 3, and then you cast a 4-drop creature, you then ramp into 7 mana going into the following turn. So you can cast this, 4-drop, and then a 7-drop the following turn to draw 3 cards. But, that just seems like, so much needs to go right. You need to cast this on turn 3 and not die. You then need to have a 4-drop creature, which even in Historic, not many decks run 4-drop creatures. And you then need to have a 7-drop creature to take advantage of the Eldrazi tokens. Not to mention, draws where you don't draw the Kozilek's Unsealing, draws where you have a bunch of 7-drops and nothing else to cast them with. So whilst this does seem like a very powerful card, I don't think it's strong enough to be a 3-mana do nothing. Maybe, again, this is another card where if I'm missing something, definitely let me know in the comments, but this doesn't even seem powerful enough for Historic, unless the metagame is super slow for some reason. The next up, we got Kudo King Among Bears, which is, I really like this card. I think it's really cool. So, there are basically 2 uses for this card, either to buff your whole board if you have a bunch of tokens, or to just completely, mitigate the abilities of your opponent's creatures, which is pretty nice. So, I think this could be interesting in Convoke, maybe, right? You run for Kuldotha Rebirth for Gleeful Demolition, you go wide really quickly, then cast this and buff your whole board, whilst also shrinking any creatures the opponents have, but, Convoke is already a very tight list, even in Historic. You don't really want to be splashing green, I don't think, and if the opponent, you attacking with everything, the opponent just fatal pushes this and then makes blocks. Like, it's a cool effect, but I just don't think it's really good enough, especially not for Timeless, but I wanted to bring it up because it's a cool card. And then finally, the last card I want to talk about here is Thief of Existence, which is one of the better Eldrazi, mainly because it's just so cheap, right? So this ETBs and can exile any non-creature, non-land permanent with mana value 4 or less. So, the One Ring, Planeswalkers, artifacts, enchantments. Pretty nice, pool of things that this can hit. And then even if it doesn't, it's essentially a 3-mana 3/4. If you have Ugin's Labyrinth, it's a 2-mana 3/4 that does this as well. So I think this is largely going to be a sideboard card. I don't think you really want to be just running this as a 3-mana 3/4 in most decks, but this does give you a very efficient answer to any non-creature, non-land permanent, and the opponent doesn't even get it back when this is killed as well. So again, it is going to be a very specific deck that you run this in because you need to have a colorless land to be able to cast it. But if you are running an Ugin's Labyrinth deck in green, this seems like a pretty decent sideboard option to bear in mind. So those are all the cards that I wanted to talk about here. Obviously, there are more cards that have been officially spoiled that I didn't talk about in this. Like, a lot of them are commons for draft and stuff. So if you feel like there's a card that's been spoiled already that I missed out on, definitely let me know in the comments, because, the sets like these are very, very difficult to evaluate, especially a set like Modern Horizons 3, where it feels like a lot of the cards are very powerful but need to be built around. They don't just slot into every deck, which makes them even more difficult to evaluate, because it's hard to figure out how good the deck that is built around it is likely to be, if that makes sense. So I would love to discuss this set with you because there's so much to talk about. So definitely let me know if there's any cards that have been spoiled already that I haven't brought up. There's obviously been a bunch of cards that got leaked as well, which I don't want to talk about until they are officially spoiled, because I know some people don't want to ruin it. Some people want to have the cards go live when they're officially spoiled. And again, I am going to be covering all the rest of the cards. So there'll definitely be a part 2, potentially a part 3. I'm not sure how many cards are left to be spoiled. Most likely just going to be another part. And like I said, definitely keep your eyes on MTGA Zone, because in the next couple of days, I'm going to be finishing an article that goes over all of these cards, plus a few others that I didn't get to mention, goes into more depth, talks about all their applications, and I'm also going to include some sample theory craft deck lists that I've got either in that article or in a separate one. So keep your eyes out on the MTGA Zone site in the next few days. Either way, honestly, I've never been more excited for a set on Arena. I'm going to be playing so much when MH3 drops, and I'm going to be pumping out deck lists, showing you everything I'm working on. I'm so excited for it. Either way, hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you on the next one. Big up.